Chapter 16. Heidegger's Ecological Existentialism. The years of chaos following the Great Defeat of 1918 effected a profound transformation in German philosophical culture. The Kantian tradition, based on excessive optimism and rationalism, was no longer satisfying to the German mind, which had rejected once and for all the Hegelianism of pure essences. Only exclusively scientific doctrines managed to survive. Philosophers found themselves obliged to investigate entirely new pathways in their quest for absolute certitude. They decided to take up the chase where Descartes had left off, in search of a reliable method for finally attaining things in themselves by stepping outside of the immanent cogito. Could it be that German philosophy had at long last abandoned its own dearest principle of radical immanentism, the enthronement of the individual consciousness divorced from external reality? Sad to say, existentialism, the product of these latter-day German upheavals, brought no improvement whatsoever. Here again we find the same classic philosophical threesome of ignorantism, egology, and revolutionism. The only difference between the various modern systems is in their relative starting points and dominant philosophical principles. Kantians put the stress on ignorantism, blossoming from a refusal of essences and from a divorce between phenomena and things in themselves. Bergsonians took creative evolution as their starting point, supposing that everything mutates into everything. Existentialists, on the other hand, and the neo-modernists with them, began with personal introspection, both immanentist and egological. They inaugurated the phenomenological method. 1. The existentialist movement. The term existentialism is not in itself proper to a particular school of philosophy. Whoever understands philosophy to be a universal wisdom striving to attain the foundation of all existing realities understands the universality of the term existentialist. In this wider sense, Socrates, Saint Socrates, Augustine, and, to an even greater extent, St. Thomas were eminently existentialist. However, this epithet is reserved historically to the 20th century philosophical reaction against German idealism and essentialism. The first existentialist was Kierkegaard. Well before the phenomenology of Husserl and of Heidegger, two philosophers whom historians easily mistake for the true fathers of the movement, the Danish minister Kierkegaard was decrying the modern-day evil of pantheism for its cold indifference to individual anguish. A horde of authors then followed his lead, all striving to shake off the same yoke of abstract ideas. They worked against the old utopian vision of a best of all possible worlds, which would have every detail of the universe determined in advance like sheet music. Husserl brought his own method to this new philosophy, a method which he called phenomenology, because it is only concerned with facts of consciousness, the impressions and thoughts of the subject. Next came Heidegger and Jaspers in Germany, and Marcel, Sartre, and Camus in France, to name only the most famous. It is no easy task to give a clear and concise definition of the movement, since there were as many forms of existentialism as there were existentialist authors. The school split into different groups. The moralists, like Farawattila, the future John Paul II, followed Max Scheler, while the personalists, Maritain for one, rallied around Mounier. The movement has sometimes been defined as that philosophy which gives precedence to existence rather than to essence, or as the philosophy concerned with the thoughts and feelings of the conscious subject. However, every author has a different notion of what these terms signify. At least they all agree on one point: existentialism is the philosophy of the concrete and of that phenomenon which is human existence. It is also talkative to describe this school of thought as the attempt to philosophize as an actor rather than as a spectator. Whereas Aristotle assumed the impersonal role of an admiring scholar before a world of marvels, Kierkegaard could only think and function of his personal problems as resolved by a deliberate, real-life choice. Existentialism thus appeared as a much more humanism than anything developed by Hegel. It was committed, passionate, and full of life. It was a flesh-and-blood philosophy, which is what made it so popular. According to the existentialist vision, philosophy is a biography. It is a session with a psychiatrist. It is an autopsy of the soul in all the tragicomedy of existence. For this reason, many existentialist authors turn toward fiction or drama, Camus, Simone de Beauvoir, Sartre, rather than toward the treatise Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty. Only a novel allows an author to present the explosion of original existence in all its unique and temporal reality. Thus, existentialist writings began as philosophical essays, but soon moved quite naturally toward purely literary works, often along the lines of a private diary. Finally, existentialism presented itself as a means of salvation, even to such confirmed atheists as Heidegger and Sartre. According to them, man should live life and possess an authentic existence by making entirely personal choices, which alone are able to free him from every form of totalitarianism, be it social, political, or religious. By refusing to conform to external constraints, and by taking in hand his own destiny, man perfects himself and works his salvation. Of all the tenets of existentialism, this last is certainly the most profound. After this brief sketch of the movement, we might propose an approximate definition of existentialism. It is the descriptive philosophy of personal human existence entirely free in its destiny. 2. Phenomenological egology. Edmund Husserl, 1859 to 1938, professor at Freiburg in Breisgau, refused a prestigious chair at the University of Berlin in order to devote his life to a subtle and complex research. To be precise, he sought to elaborate the principles of an absolutely certain knowledge, as defined by him in 1931 in his Cartesian Meditations. His phenomenological method, supposedly original and a source of liberation, is in fact a return to Descartes, a search for the Northwest Passage between the inside of man and his outside, from the immanent to the real. Husserl cast doubt upon all knowledge. Descartes' fundamental "I think, therefore I am" included, and found himself alone with pure consciousness. Now, because consciousness is always consciousness of something, that something must exist. Eureka! Like Bergson in France, Husserl believed his musings had brought him at last to the fundamental truth, source of all that is true. Man is conscious of his own personal thoughts and impressions, which are the facts of consciousness, already described at length by Schleiermacher. Husserl's discovery of the whole world within the depths of the consciousness, purely reflexive thought, is a return to Kant's knowledge of phenomena. It is Schleiermacher's subjective experience of God within the self. It is Bergsonian experience welling up from the individual consciousness. This latter-day reincarnation of egology could not bring the mind of man any closer to the real, but only to facts of consciousness, simple projections of the self. It contained no criteria for distinguishing reality from dreams or being from imagining. In the Husserlian fairy tale, the shadow of a groom, armed with the shadow of a brush, stands forever grooming the shadow of a horse. Husserl's new method, so touted as the guide to lead man at last out of the interior prison of the cogito, had no veritable originality and certainly no power of liberation. Martin Heidegger, 1889 to 1976, who succeeded Husserl at the same university, followed in the footsteps of the master by his exclusive interest in the facts of consciousness. Heidegger took on the essential philosophical question, what is being? The question gave a name to Heidegger's system, existentialism. How did Heidegger conceive of being? Did he finally manage to step beyond facts of consciousness? No, alas. For every one of the existentialists, the world in itself is an absurd chaos. The only living world is the world for self, the world as present to the gaze of the human consciousness, receiving its meaning and coming into existence only in reference to man. Existentialist thinkers describe their doctrine as akin to the common experience of awaking a sleeping world simply by one's presence. The existentialist outside world, seemingly dead, is more than mere nothingness, but it has no meaning in itself and ultimately disappears as another living world dawns on the horizon of our consciousness. In spite of its encouraging label, existentialist philosophy is permanently severed from existence because of its fundamental and exclusive attachment to Kantian, Husserlian phenomena. If no human being exists, declared Heidegger, no world is there either. In its ultimate signification, humanism refers to any philosophical doctrine which explains and evaluates being as a whole based on man and in view of man. I am the being by whom there is being. Being belongs to us, it can be present only by us. Sartre thought the same. The upsurge of a for itself, or consciousness, is what makes there be a world. Merleau-Ponty was more radical. I am the absolute source. My existence does not come from my antecedents, from my physical and social entourage. It goes toward them and sustains them. The fundamental existentialist principle is indeed the cogito, I think, therefore I am. Being is thought, and thought creates being. Our philosophers do not stop there, but move a step further into absolute egology. Not only does being obey consciousness, but the consciousness obeys free will. Existence and liberty are completely identical. In their jargon, to exist is to go beyond oneself. It is to invent oneself freely, to create one's own essence and create the world. I must be free. I must be self-impelled and able to say, I am because I will. I am my own beginning. The veritable existence, the veritable creation, comes with being free. It comes with being a man in the full sense of the word. Freedom will never be the lot of conformists who have alienated their identity. They can only say, one does, and never I do. Men who have abdicated their liberty have reduced themselves to the rank of objects. They are nothing at all, for they have no authentic existence. To the existentialist, liberty means becoming, changing. It means responsibility and true human existence, outside of which all is static, inhuman, and dead. For him, the genuine man is not only created free, he is freedom. Thus, in Sartre's play The Flies, Orestes retorts to Zeus, "You should not have made me free. No sooner had you created me than I ceased to be yours. And there was nothing left in heaven, no right or wrong, nor anyone to give me orders. I shall not return unto your law. I am doomed to have no other law but mine. For I, Zeus, am a man, and every man must find out his own way." Existentialists consider absolute liberty, which is the whole of man, as a rival to God. To admit that God exists is to lose liberty and become alienated from oneself. Moreover, it merits a man the dishonorable title of bastard. The most radical existentialists thus opted for liberty and denied God. Yet the liberty they chose is not a rosy one. It is an irrational instinct, without ideal or guide or goal. Existentialist existence is tragic. It is man, who never asked to be born, thrown into an absurd, pointless, concrete situation. It is man condemned to liberty, condemned to living without standard or measure of good and evil, condemned to choose his destiny, fully aware that his destiny leads nowhere. Understandably, then, the most revealing sentiment inspired by existence is nausea, the title of one of Sartre's novels. In existentialism, everything is topsy-turvy. Being, intelligence, and will suddenly become identical. It is the paroxysm of voluntarism, the I think, I will, it is. I will, I think, it is. Nothing can resist this will of iron as our philosophers knead and mold reality. Existentialist philosophy is radically anthropomorphic and perfectly solipsistic. All things come from the individual self. It is the ultimate and most logically satisfying capitulation before the age-old temptation to immanence. The Greek sophist Protagoras was the first officially to auto-decree himself the measure of all things. He passed the torch to Kant, who rendered thought and morality absolutely autonomous. Bergson, in turn, traced all reality back to the subconscious. The existentialists, in turn, finally announced, "I am the absolute source." Man is henceforth a self-appointed absolute, building upon the ruins of the absolute. 3. Existentialist ignorantism. For a realist, things are because they have a certain nature, and as such can be the object of rational knowledge. This reality is something the 3-year-old takes for granted when he reaches the inquisitive stage. "What's that, Daddy?" "What's that?" Yet ever since Kant and Hegel, with the complicity of Bergson, idealists of every stripe have persisted in denying the mind access to being, its proper object. They consistently oblige the mind to feed upon subjective dreams and facts of consciousness. Why? For two reasons, upon which we have already touched in our discussion of Kantian agnosticism. They deny that things in themselves have a certain nature. They claim that to know does not mean to be informed by reality, but on the contrary, to inform reality, or rather deform it. The existentialists, who for their name and pretensions are often labeled realists, had in fact accepted the same old idealist preconceptions. As to the first point, the existentialist system embodies the denial of essences more strongly than idealism ever did. This denial of essences makes up the second major principle of existentialism. Existence precedes essence. Man firstly is, only secondarily is he, this, or that. Man creates his own essence and the entire universe with it. The system goes even further and claims that existence can still exist when deprived of its essence. Affirming such a thing is like saying the race runs, sight sees, and wine can hold itself in place without the cooperation of a wineglass. It amounts to saying that there is no essence at all, either in things or in man. Yet, if Peter does not have a human nature, and if the poplar does not possess the essence of a tree, how can I have a rational knowledge of either one? For existentialists, then, knowledge is as unstable as reality. For this reason, existentialism cannot endure any kind of eternal truth. Newton's laws, the principle of contradiction, any truth whatever. These are true only as long as human existence is. Truth is valid only within the temporal limits of existence. Before there was any human existence, there was no truth, nor will there be any after human existence is no more. Existentialism is a crusade against intellectual oppression. For them, reason, though glorified for centuries, is in fact the most striking contradiction in all of human thought. Socrates burned incense to reason. The task at hand is to dethrone it once and for all. As to the second point, existentialists were again the slavish imitators of Kantian idealists. According to them, reason cannot be informed by the nature of concrete being. They build an impassable barrier between reality and reason, such that reason is nourished not on reality, but only on a man's own ideas as constructed by reason itself or by simple consciousness. Kantian brains do not think reality. They think their thoughts alone. It is as though someone were to offer a German appetite mere thoughts of sausage and sauerkraut, with no real sausage nor any real sauerkraut following behind. Not even a little pint of beer to hoodwink his stomach. The existentialist school of thought is equally anti-realist, since it, too, reaches simple appearances and phenomena, and never concrete being. Within their system, we remain prisoners of the Kantian distinction between the phenomenon we know, the appearance, and the noumenon we don't know, the thing in itself. Sartre openly expressed his debt to Kant. Modern thought has realized considerable progress by reducing the existent to a series of appearances which manifest it. The being of the existent is exactly what it appears. Our theory of the phenomenon has replaced the reality of the thing by the objectivity of the phenomenon. For Heidegger, the human consciousness is what transforms raw objects so as to give them meaning. Thus, man is fundamentally defined not by his faculty to reason, but by his freedom severed from reason. Existentialists understand freedom as a spontaneous, irrational instinct, perfectly absurd and outside the realm of the rational. Their position is beyond ignorantism. It is absurdity. After a conscientious reading of Sartre's defining work, Being and Nothingness, the only possible conclusion is non-comprehension. The author would be the first to answer that, indeed, there is nothing to understand because everything in it is absurd. Yet ought we to be satisfied with absurdity as the last word in philosophy? How could such a theory of the absurd even claim to be a philosophy at all? 4. Existentialist revolutionism. The third principle of existentialism is that the present moment is creative. Since all is pure existence and there are no stable essences, it follows that beings are devoid of identity or permanence. They are incapable of the width, breadth, or depth which would allow them to emerge from the present moment of a universe in perpetual flux. It is at every moment that man must choose, assess himself anew, and surpass himself, for such is to exist. Existence is not a state. It is an act which creates the essence of man and keeps the world in suspense as he gives it existence. A human being who fully identifies himself with the present moment knows he is permanently threatened with non-existence in all that he is, thinks, and does. Man is but a situation. Each one of our acts throws the meaning of the world and man's place in the universe back into question. Man is responsible for his own making or unmaking, but, in addition, upon his personal choice hangs the existence of all things and of the world itself. A universal responsibility bears upon each human act. Moreover, this necessity to choose oneself is constantly repeated. Each moment is at once creative and eschatological. Man stands in the place of God the Father as depicted by Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel, with a wave of the hand creating or annihilating a universe. For Sartre, being is one with the event and the situation. For Bergson, being is duration. For Heidegger, being is time. Thus, for all of them, being, and with it the essence of all things, is pure becoming. The existentialist vision of a radically changeable and relative human nature would bear its noxious fruit in the situation ethics of Rahner's existentialism. As with Hegel, being is identical to nothingness. Being does exist, but it vanishes into the event, since ultimately it is not. For Heidegger, the faithful echo of Nietzsche, becoming is being. All is flux. We are at the dawn of the most enormous transformation of the earth. Time and history. We are in the night. We await the day. Heidegger also follows Nietzsche in his interpretation of the death of God. All that is suprasensible essences, and all things static, is dead and has been replaced by the will to power, which is dynamic. Being as imagined by Plato or Moses or the Church, being as substance, being as immobility, being as identity, is obsolete. Being is now recognized as becoming. Christian revelation bestowed once and for all in the fullness of an immutable deposit to endure until the end of time is absurd. For Heidegger, the incarnate Word, who claimed to affix the flux of history upon his cross by choosing a place and a time for saving humanity, is simply non-being. The neo-modernists took to the existentialist line of thought. The Protestant exegete Ricoeur, who was to have so great an influence on progressive thought, opposed the "he comes" of Scripture to the "he is" of Greek thought, for we must open ourselves up to the new creation. The theologian Rahner declared that Christianity is the religion of the future, and of a future which is the absolute. As such, it only fully grasps its object in the form of a not yet. The neo-modernists were close behind, modeling God after the image and likeness of man. For Conger, human activity is the action of God. In Chenu's mind, the divine is the self-liberation of man. In the words of Laurentin, God is not yet. The existentialist starting point is egological immanentism. Nothing deserves to exist except my consciousness and what is within, and my consciousness is none other than my freedom. Hence the equation, I will, I think, it is. Upon this egological foundation, existentialist philosophy constructs a denial of the essences of things, their intelligibility and stability, and so finds itself renewing the idealist conclusions it had meant to oppose. Nothing is knowable except the conscious self, which is the creative principle and the end of all that is. All things are in permanent evolution. Of all philosophical trends, this one is probably the most anti-intellectual and the most revolutionary, since it draws all thought from man, whereas the others at least began with things. Perhaps this school of thought owed more to Bergson than it would have liked to admit, for he was the great modernist mentor by his emphasis on the role of the consciousness and of intuitive sympathy. Moreover, the evident variation of the different groups within existentialism does not drown out their common melody. Just as for the idealists Kant and Hegel, their fundamental preoccupation seems to have been not so much philosophical as theological, or rather, atheological. Sartre had at least the courtesy to admit that atheism was the principle and motive behind his philosophy. Existentialism is nothing else but an attempt to draw the full conclusions from a consistently atheistic position. His admission illustrates once again the basic, ineluctable choice dividing ideas, beings, and men. Either submit oneself to being, facts, and reason, and ultimately to God, through a healthy philosophy and belief, or else free oneself from being, facts, and reason so as the better to free oneself from God. In making their choice, Heidegger and his companions founded the existentialist philosophy of absurdity and absolute license. In the last analysis, they succeeded in founding the philosophy of nothingness.